Hello and welcome back to The Curious Edge, where after a very brief 4-year intermission, we are back to making videos, and today we're talking about the real King Arthur. I'm sure at one point you've probably heard the name King Arthur, legendary once and future King of the Britons. Where did these legends come from? And are there any grains of truth to be found in them? Find out with me today as we dive into the real history of King Arthur. The first major source we have for the King Arthur tale is one written by the Welsh cleric Geoffrey of Monmouth in his 12th century manuscript called The History of the Kings of Britain. But keep in mind that the tale of Arthur is based around 500 AD, leaving over 700 years for some of the details to get muddled and plenty of time for exaggerations and fanciful details to be thrown in. However, in essence, any historical Arthur was from the end of the 5th century and was a leader of the Britons, not the English, as England would not exist for another 400 years. So let's take a look back at the Britain of Arthur's time. The last permanently stationed Roman legion left Britain in 406 AD, and the Emperor of the Western Roman Empire told the British they were on their own in 410 AD. And it is believed the first man to rise to power after they left was Vortigern, by about 425 AD, who historians are pretty sure existed, even though we don't know too much about him. Vortigern led a pretty weakened Britain, with constant raids from the Picts and Irish and a famine on his hands. He needed help. His first port of call was to ask the Romans, and they did help at first. The first 2 times he called for aid, they were able to send a legion over to repel the invaders. However, in 446 AD, when the British sent a third request called the Groans of the Britons, which read, "The barbarians drive us to the sea drives us to the barbarians. Between these 2 means of death, we are either killed or drowned." Rome simply didn't have the troops to spare and left the Britons to fend for themselves. So this is when Vortigern invited the Anglo-Saxon mercenaries over to protect the Britons from the Irish and Picts. Now, if you know anything about the history of Dark Age Britain, you're probably aware of how terrible an idea it was for the Britons to invite the Anglo-Saxons over. The Saxons themselves were also in quite the pickle, with the collapsing Roman Empire causing great barbarian migration such as the Visigoths and Huns to the south and east, and rising sea levels flooding their homeland from the north and west. They were already looking for an escape, and Vortigern had just handed them the keys to a large and bountiful territory where the only real military force was them. The Saxon mercenaries quickly turned into war bands, and according to Gildas, had dipped their red and savage tongue in the Western Ocean before they were finally repelled by Ambrosius Aurelianus, the next leader of the Britons. Ambrosius is interesting because not only is he probably a real person, but also has a place in the Arthurian narrative as King Arthur's uncle. So he acts as a person who bridges the gap between history and legend. However, despite initial success from Ambrosius, Gildas goes on to write, "From that time the citizens were sometimes victorious, sometimes the enemy. This continued up to the year of the siege of Badon Hill, and of almost the last great slaughter inflicted upon the rascally crew." Now, Gildas doesn't actually say Ambrosius was the one leading the British at the Battle of Badon, and from the fact most historians think that the battle, if it took place at all, took place around 500 AD, where Ambrosius would have been too old to still be a commander of the British forces. However, it is clear that this battle, or series of battles, is the one that finally stopped the Saxons, as we know from archaeological evidence, such as grave stiles, that this is about the time their advance across the country was halted. While it's very unlikely it was Ambrosius leading the men, there is another man that is said to have led the Britons at the Battle of Badon, and supposedly he single-handedly killed 960 men there. King Arthur. That 960 might have been an exaggeration. On the definite history side of things, historians aren't sure why exactly the Saxons stopped. Many believe that a war leader among the British banded the Britons together and defeated the invading Saxons in a series of battles. Certainly, if the tale of Arthur had not been written, you'd need to invent a character like him to make sense of the archaeology, and that this individual, even if they're not exactly the King Arthur of the stories, might certainly be the primary inspiration of the tale. In a 6th century document of Gothic history by historian Jordaens, a king of all the Britons is described called Riothamus, who reigned in the late 5th century. Riothamus was asked by the Romans to repel the barbarians in northern France. These campaigns started around the year 469 AD, where Riothamus was betrayed by the Burgundians, who then joined the Visigoths, ambushed the Britons, and then slew the Romans. However, what's interesting about Riothamus is that Riothamus isn't a name at all. It's a title, which means highest king, or supreme king, which is precisely what Arthur was. I believe that the stories from both Ambrosius Aurelianus and his successor, who were both the leaders of the Britons at different consecutive time periods, almost certainly fused together in the 700 years since, and either one of them could have been the Riothamus campaigning in France. What's important here is that the High King of Britain campaigned in France just as Geoffrey describes King Arthur campaigning in France in his story. And the High King of the Britons was betrayed, just as betrayal is such a major aspect in the legend of Arthur, first from Lancelot and then from Mordred. But before moving on, a lot of you might be thinking that Ambrosius Aurelianus sounds far too Roman of a name for a British king. Well, his name didn't stay as Ambrosius. According to Geoffrey, after seeing a dragon-shaped comet in the sky, he changed his epithet to Pendragon, or Chief Dragon, and began to use a dragon as his sigil. This epithet was taken by his younger brother Uther upon his death, which Uther then of course passed along to his son, Arthur. So to conclude, Arthur was probably based on Dark Age Britons, who rose in the ashes of Roman Britannia to band together its inhabitants against Saxon invaders towards the end of the 5th century. So now we have a better understanding of the possible King Arthur figures in history. Join me in part 2, where we learn about the castles, swords, and knights of the real King Arthur. But until then, thanks for watching, guys. Remember to like the video if you did, subscribe if you want to see future videos on topics like the lost letters of the English alphabet or mysterious architecture from across the world. And if you want to support the channel, check out my game on Steam. It's a comedic fantasy RPG called Quest, and it's available right now. Also, remember to check out my other videos, such as the location of Atlantis and cargo cults, if those sound like interesting topics to you. Until next time, guys, goodbye.